Lighthouses were built to guide ships to safety, but some of them hide secrets darker than the ocean itself. Isolated on jagged cliffs, surrounded by endless storms, and haunted by the tragedies of those who lived and died, inside their walls, these beacons of light became prisons of terror. Tonight, we'll uncover 3 disturbing eerie lighthouse horror stories that will make you think twice before ever stepping inside one again. Lighthouses stand tall and proud along coastlines, their beams slicing through the darkest nights and fiercest storms, guiding sailors to safety. To many, they are symbols of hope, guardians of the sea that never sleep. Yet, behind their stone walls and spiraling staircases lies another story, one far less comforting. These isolated towers have been silent witnesses to tragedy, madness, and unexplained events that blur the line between history and horror. When you strip away their heroic reputation, lighthouses reveal themselves as some of the most chilling places on Earth, places where solitude can drive men insane and where death often lingers in the shadows. The very design of a lighthouse adds to its eeriness. A narrow tower, often perched on desolate rocks far from human company, it traps its keepers inside with the relentless howl of the wind and the ceaseless crash of waves. Imagine spending weeks, even months, in such isolation, with nothing but the distant sea as company. Supplies came rarely. Storms cut off communication, and when illness or injury struck, help was often too far away. In this silence and confinement, human minds began to bend. Many keepers reported hearing footsteps echoing on empty stairwells, voices whispering their names when no one else was around, and strange knocks on heavy iron doors that should have been impossible in the midst of a raging storm. For some, these experiences were brushed off as tricks of fatigue and loneliness. But for others, they became inescapable nightmares. Stories passed down through generations reveal that many lighthouses became prisons of despair. Keepers were sometimes stationed alone, left to fend for themselves in environments that offered no comfort. The endless isolation gnawed at their sanity, leading to terrifying consequences. In some accounts, men vanished without explanation, leaving meals untouched and lanterns unlit. In others, arguments escalated into violence, with blood spilled on the very stones meant to save lives. These tragedies gave birth to the belief that lighthouses could hold a curse, binding the spirits of those who perished to the place of their suffering. Sailors began to whisper that certain lights were haunted, that ghostly figures could be seen climbing the stairs or standing watch in the lantern room long after their deaths. But perhaps what makes lighthouse horror so disturbing is how it blends the natural with the supernatural. The sea is already a powerful and terrifying force, capable of swallowing ships whole and leaving no trace of their crews. Combine that with the claustrophobic chambers of a lighthouse, and you create a perfect setting for both real and imagined horrors. Even the most skeptical admit that the isolation has a way of warping perception. Shadows stretch strangely in the flickering lamplight. The groan of the tower in the wind becomes a moan, and the salt-stained walls seem to breathe with the dampness of the sea. When reality itself feels unstable, it is not difficult to believe that the dead still linger nearby. Historical records confirm that the lives of lighthouse keepers were riddled with hardship and death. Shipwrecks often occurred within view of the light, and keepers could do nothing but watch as sailors drowned within earshot of their cries. Some were driven mad by guilt, believing they had failed their duty, while others claimed the voices of the lost returned on stormy nights, carried on the wind, pleading for rescue long after their bodies had sunk beneath the waves. Even when no shipwrecks occurred, tragedy still stalked the towers. Accidents on the slippery rocks claimed lives, illnesses spread unchecked, and storms shattered windows and crushed keepers beneath falling debris. For every story of bravery and endurance, there was another of misery and horror, etched forever into the history of these lonely outposts. Visitors today still report unsettling experiences when touring old lighthouses. Cold spots that defy explanation, the sensation of being watched, and the distant sound of boots on stairs are common. Paranormal investigators are drawn to them, convinced that the combination of violent deaths, isolation, and constant exposure to the untamed elements leaves a psychic imprint on the stone walls. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, the atmosphere inside a lighthouse is undeniably heavy, as though the air itself remembers centuries of suffering. Even the bravest admit that standing alone at the top of a tower, surrounded by nothing but endless black water, can awaken a primal fear that is hard to shake. It is this mixture of history, tragedy, and legend that gives lighthouses their haunted legacy. They are not just towers of light, but monuments to human endurance and human fragility. Places where the fight against nature sometimes ended in victory, but often dissolved into despair. Life inside a lighthouse was never as romantic as the paintings or postcards suggest. While the sight of a beacon glowing against a stormy night sky might inspire awe, the reality for those tasked with tending it was far harsher. The keepers who lived in these isolated towers faced a constant battle against the elements, the crushing weight of solitude, and the ever-present threat of death. Few jobs demanded such resilience, and fewer still extracted such a toll on the human spirit. It was in these conditions that seeds of horror naturally took root, for when storms and isolation combined, they created a crucible where fear and despair flourished. Storms at sea are unlike any storm on land. Waves rise higher than buildings, winds howl with a ferocity that seems almost alive, and rain lashes against the windows like shards of glass. For the lighthouse keeper, there was no escape from these tempests. The tower shook under the assault, floors groaned, and water forced its way through cracks, no matter how carefully the structure had been built. Keepers were expected to climb the endless spiral stairs, maintain the light, and ensure the beacon remained visible, even as the world outside seemed intent on tearing the tower apart. Many accounts tell of men working with trembling hands, their hearts racing as the storm threatened to extinguish the very lamp they had sworn to keep burning. In those moments, with death pounding at the door, fear took on a physical presence, and it was easy to imagine unseen forces lurking in the roaring blackness just beyond the glass. Yet the storms themselves were not the only torment. Between them came the silence, long stretches of stillness broken only by the sound of waves and the distant cry of gulls. For keepers stationed alone, this silence became unbearable. Day after day bled into one another, with no companionship, no distractions, and no escape. Even those with families often found the isolation too heavy to bear, as children grew restless and spouses fell into despair. Letters from keepers described the endless monotony, how the days stretched like an unbroken horizon, and how every creak of the tower at night could spark dread. Loneliness, like the sea, wore down even the strongest, driving some to madness and others to desperate acts. Death was a frequent visitor to lighthouses. Supplies arrived by boat, and when storms raged, these deliveries could be delayed for weeks. Illness, even something minor, could become fatal in such conditions. Many died waiting for rescue that never came, their bodies kept in makeshift coffins, or even stored in cupboards until the weather allowed them to be taken away. For the survivors, being trapped with a corpse in a confined tower only deepened the psychological torment. In some cases, storms prevented the removal of the dead for so long that keepers reported hearing the sound of the body shifting at night, as though refusing to rest. These experiences wove themselves into ghost stories that would later be passed down as warnings, cautioning others about the cursed nature of the job. Some tragedies unfolded more violently. Stories tell of keepers who turned against one another, their tempers frayed by weeks of confinement. Fights broke out over small disagreements, but in the suffocating isolation of a lighthouse, even trivial arguments could escalate into bloodshed. In one infamous case, a keeper's death was ruled an accident, though whispers among sailors claimed it was murder, born out of madness and desperation. The details of such incidents were often covered up, yet the rumors persisted, painting lighthouses as places where men's minds cracked under pressure, leading them to acts they would never have imagined on the mainland. For sailors at sea, lighthouses were lifelines, but for those trapped within, they were often prisons. The endless responsibility of keeping the light burning weighed heavily. To falter meant disaster, to fail meant lives lost, and such a burden could haunt a man even in his dreams. Some claimed they could hear the cries of drowning sailors on stormy nights, their voices carried through the wind, accusing the keeper of negligence. These phantom sounds blurred the line between guilt and haunting, leaving men uncertain whether they were losing their minds or truly hearing the voices of the dead. The sea offered no answers, only its eternal, indifferent roar. Even today, accounts from those who visit abandoned lighthouses describe a sense of oppression, as though the walls themselves remember every storm, every scream, every death that occurred inside. The combination of relentless natural fury and unyielding isolation left scars not just on the keepers, but on the very stones of the towers they inhabited. Each lighthouse carries its own history of storms weathered and lives lost, and each one is steeped in the kind of atmosphere that makes it impossible to ignore the darker side of their existence. The disappearance of the 3 keepers from the Flannan Isles lighthouse in December of 1900 remains one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries in maritime history. Known locally as Mar, the rocky island off the coast of Scotland was already a place of desolation. battered by unrelenting winds and waves that crashed endlessly against its cliffs. To live there was to accept isolation as a companion, and for the 3 men stationed to tend the light, life meant long stretches of silence punctuated only by the sound of the sea. But what happened in that lonely outpost shocked the world, because when the relief vessel arrived after Christmas to bring supplies and change shifts, the lighthouse stood silent, its beacon extinguished, and its keepers gone without a trace. The first sign that something was wrong came as the crew of the relief ship drew near the island. The lighthouse, which should have been shining brightly to guide them in, was dark. No signal flag flew, no movement could be seen on the rocky shore. When the men finally managed to land, they were met with an eerie stillness. The entrance door was firmly shut, but unlocked, and the interior appeared strangely untouched. In the kitchen, a meal had been left behind as if abandoned mid-bite. A chair lay overturned, adding to the unsettling sense that something had gone terribly wrong in an instant. Yet there were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, only the absence of the men who had sworn to keep the light burning. The official records kept by the keepers themselves offered tantalizing clues, but no real answers. Log entries described fierce storms battering the island, waves so powerful they rose higher than the cliffs themselves, and the emotional toll it seemed to take on the men. One entry reportedly mentioned a sense of dread among the keepers, as if they felt something unnatural looming over them. But the strangest part was that in the days leading up to their disappearance, nearby vessels recorded relatively calm weather, suggesting that either the log was exaggerated or that something else entirely had caused the disturbance. The logs ended abruptly, and after that, the story shifted from fact into speculation. Investigators suggested a number of possible explanations. The most mundane theory was that the men had gone outside during a storm to secure equipment or supplies, only to be swept away by the sea. The violent Atlantic could easily have claimed them, leaving no trace of their bodies. Yet this explanation never fully satisfied those who examined the scene. Why had all 3 men vanished at once, when standard practice dictated that at least one keeper should remain inside at all times? Why were certain pieces of clothing and gear left behind, as though the men had gone out in haste? And what about the mysterious overturned chair, the uneaten meal, the locked but unbarred doors? Theories piled up, but certainty never came. As word of the disappearance spread, rumors began to take on a life of their own. Some whispered that the men had been driven mad by isolation and turned on one another, ending in violence and death that was somehow covered up by the sea. Others claimed the island was cursed, haunted by restless spirits or mythical beings from old Scottish legends. Tales of ghostly figures wandering the cliffs at night and strange lights flickering on the rocks only deepened the sense of mystery. Superstitious sailors even refused to pass too closely to the island after dark, fearing that whatever had claimed the keepers might reach out for them too. The story of Eilean never took root in the imagination precisely because of its unanswered questions. Unlike many tragedies at sea, where wreckage or bodies eventually surfaced, this one left nothing. The keepers simply ceased to exist, swallowed by a force that left no trace. Their families were left with grief compounded by uncertainty, forever wondering what final moments the men endured. Did they fight against the raging waters, calling for help no one could hear? Did something more sinister drag them from their posts, leaving only silence behind? The truth, locked away by time and tide, remained hidden, and perhaps that is what makes the tale so haunting. Even now, more than a century later, visitors to the Flannan Isles speak of the uneasy atmosphere that hangs over the place. The wind carries a strange, almost mournful sound as it whips around the abandoned tower, and the empty rooms seem to echo with absence. Modern paranormal investigators have been drawn to the site, convinced that the spirits of the lost keepers remain tethered to the island, bound to the mystery of their vanishing. Rational minds may cling to natural explanations, but standing there, with the endless Atlantic stretching out on all sides and the battered lighthouse looming above, it is easy to believe that something beyond human understanding happened on that lonely rock in 1900, something that left the world with one of its most enduring lighthouse horrors. Fog has always been one of the most unsettling natural phenomena, a shroud that cloaks the world in silence and obscurity. For lighthouse keepers, it was not merely an inconvenience but a recurring terror. When fog rolled in from the sea, it swallowed the horizon, muffled every sound, and reduced visibility to almost nothing. The great lamps were lit and foghorns blared into the void, but even so, many keepers described the sensation of being completely cut off from the world. It was in these conditions that strange phenomena were most often reported, whispers of something otherworldly moving in the mist, footsteps echoing where no one should have been, and figures appearing briefly before dissolving into the vapor. Many accounts from keepers describe the same chilling experience, hearing footsteps on the spiral staircase during the densest fog. The sound was distinct, the creak of boots on stone, slow and deliberate, sometimes even accompanied by the faint rattle of keys or the scrape of a hand brushing the wall. When investigated, the staircase would always be empty, leaving the keeper shaken and unsure whether his mind had betrayed him, or whether he had genuinely been sharing the tower with something unseen. In a job where solitude was expected, the possibility of an intruder was terrifying, yet the absence of anyone tangible was even worse. The fog seemed to play tricks, bending sound and conjuring presences that could not be explained. There are also countless stories of ghostly figures emerging from the mist outside. Some keepers swore they saw men in ragged sailors' uniforms walking across the rocks, their faces pale and expressionless, only to vanish the moment the fog shifted. Others spoke of women in long dresses standing on the cliffs, gazing out to sea, weeping silently before dissolving into the air. These visions were often tied to past tragedies, shipwrecks where entire crews had perished within sight of the light, or families that had lost loved ones to the unforgiving waves. The fog, it seemed, acted as a veil between the living and the dead, thinning the boundary just enough for the past to bleed through into the present. For some keepers, the horror came not from what they saw but from what they heard. Whispers were a recurring theme, soft voices drifting through the mist, sometimes calling their names, sometimes speaking in words they could not understand. These whispers often grew louder at night, seeping through the walls and filling the tower with a presence that felt invasive and suffocating. More than one keeper admitted in letters or diaries that he had begun to answer back, desperate for some kind of companionship in the endless silence, only to realize with mounting dread that whatever he was speaking to was not human. The sound of footsteps circling the base of the lighthouse, knocks on the heavy wooden door, and the scrape of something sharp against the windows were also recorded. Yet whenever these noises were investigated, the fog yielded no culprit. Sailors who passed by lighthouses shrouded in fog also reported unsettling encounters. Some claimed they heard phantom bells or horns that did not match the signals of the light itself, guiding them not away from danger but directly toward the rocks. Others spoke of seeing lights moving within the fog, as though another ship were near, only for the glow to vanish suddenly, leaving them disoriented and drifting toward disaster. Superstition grew around certain lighthouses, with seafarers convinced that malevolent spirits used the mist as cover to lure ships to their doom. Whether these tales were exaggerations, or the result of fear-clouding judgment, they reinforced the reputation of lighthouses as places where the supernatural thrived. The psychological strain of enduring such conditions cannot be underestimated. Fog could last for days, even weeks, and during that time the world outside the lighthouse became a gray void. Human beings are not built to live without reference points, without sight of the horizon or the comfort of clear skies, and the constant disorientation wore down even the strongest keepers. In such an environment, the mind was fertile ground for paranoia and hallucination. A creak in the wall became a footstep, a shadow became a figure, and a distant call became a whisper meant only for the listener. Yet dismissing every account as madness ignores the consistency of the stories told by keepers across different lighthouses and decades, all describing nearly identical experiences of footsteps in fog that should have been empty. Even modern visitors to abandoned lighthouses tell of the same sensations. Walking through dense mist, they feel the prickle of being watched, hear the faint sound of someone following close behind, and catch glimpses of movement at the edge of vision. Technology has done little to erase these phenomena. Paranormal investigators with recording devices have captured unexplained sounds. Boots on stone, doors closing, and voices murmuring that match the testimonies of long-dead keepers. Scientists may argue about acoustics and the way fog carries sound, but those who have felt the weight of that invisible presence insist it goes far beyond mere tricks of the environment. The fog itself became a symbol of everything uncanny about lighthouses, a living curtain that both protected and concealed. It shielded the horrors of the sea, but also gave them a stage on which to manifest. To stand in a lighthouse enveloped by fog was to stand in two worlds at once, the realm of the living and something beyond, where the cries of the drowned and the steps of the lost still echoed through the mist. The story of the tragic lighthouse bride has been told in hushed tones along coastlines, a tale of love and loss, that transformed into one of the most enduring ghost stories connected to these lonely towers. It begins with a young woman who married a lighthouse keeper, following him to his post on a remote and storm-battered island. The idea of living in such a place seemed romantic at first, a life of quiet devotion, with the ocean as their constant companion. But the harsh reality soon revealed itself. Isolation weighed heavily, storms pounded the walls of their stone prison, and the routine of tending the light left little room for joy. Yet she stayed, bound by love and duty, until tragedy struck and her story was forever etched into the lore of the sea. Accounts differ on the exact cause of her death. Some say she fell ill during a storm, and with no way to summon help, she died in the keeper's arms. Others claim she slipped on the slick rocks while gathering supplies, the waves swallowing her before her husband could reach her. In some versions, her death was more sinister, with whispers of a violent quarrel that ended in despair. Whatever the truth, the result was the same: a young life cut short, leaving the lighthouse steeped in grief. For the keeper left behind, the isolation grew unbearable. Some reports say he continued his duties with mechanical precision, tending the light by night and mourning by day. But others insist he descended into madness, unable to endure the crushing silence of the tower without her. It was not long after her death that stories began to spread of her presence lingering within the lighthouse. Sailors passing the island claimed they saw a pale figure in white standing near the lantern room, her face turned toward the sea, as though searching for something just out of reach. Keepers who later took up residence reported the sound of weeping echoing through the halls at night, soft at first and then rising to a wail that carried through the stone walls. Some described the sensation of a cold hand brushing against them as they climbed the stairs, or the flicker of movement in their periphery when no one else should have been there. The grief that had filled the lighthouse during her final days seemed to seep into the very walls, ensuring that no one who came after could escape it. What makes the story of the Lighthouse Bride so disturbing is the mixture of love and sorrow that saturates every version of it. Unlike tales of madness or unexplained vanishing, hers is rooted in the universal human experience of loss. Those who believe in spirits say it is her devotion that keeps her bound to the place, unwilling to leave the tower where she shared her final moments of happiness. Others argue it is sorrow or anger that anchors her there, her spirit restless because of the unfairness of her fate. Whatever the cause, the manifestations attributed to her are among the most persistent of lighthouse hauntings, with accounts spanning decades and passed down through generations of sailors and keepers alike. Locals near such lighthouses often add their own details to the legend. Fishermen say that on stormy nights her cries can be heard over the roar of the sea, a keening sound that cuts through wind and thunder. Tourists who have visited abandoned lighthouses tell of sudden chills, as though stepping into a pocket of grief that still clings to the stones. Some paranormal investigators claim to have captured recordings of a woman's voice, low and sorrowful, calling out for her husband or for the sea to give her back what it had taken. These stories reinforce the idea that her spirit remains forever tied to the place, unable to rest even as time marches on. The haunting of the Lighthouse Bride has become a symbol of the price exacted by isolation. The sea does not care for human happiness, and the towers built to defy it often became tombs rather than havens. The story resonates because it is not only about death but about devotion, about how love can become an anchor just as much as grief. Standing inside one of these lighthouses today, visitors often describe an atmosphere heavy with melancholy, as though the air itself remembers her final days. Even skeptics, who dismiss ghost stories as superstition or the product of imagination, admit that something about the tale lingers, an ache that cannot be explained away. Her story, though tragic, continues to echo wherever lighthouse legends are told, a reminder that not all horrors are born of madness or mystery. Some are born simply of love, loss, and the merciless isolation of a tower on the edge of the sea. Among the darkest tales, tied to lighthouses, is the story of the keeper who went mad, a man whose mind unraveled within the confines of his solitary watchtower, until tragedy stained the lantern room itself. The life of a lighthouse keeper was already filled with strain, endless hours, monotonous duties, and the relentless isolation that pressed down harder with each passing day. For most, the challenge was endured in silence, but for a few, the weight of solitude proved unbearable. Madness, once it took root, often grew swiftly in such environments, fed by the unbroken roar of the sea and the suffocating sense of being trapped. One such tale stands out, whispered along coastal towns, of a keeper who lost his grip on reality and left behind a legacy of blood and fear. He was described in records as a diligent worker, a man who rarely complained, though neighbors in the nearest village recalled a distant look in his eyes whenever he returned from his post. Weeks alone at the lighthouse seemed to change him, hollowing out his expression, leaving him gaunt and restless. His journals, preserved in fragments, reveal the early stages of his decline. At first, he wrote about the storms and the difficulty of maintaining the machinery, but soon the entries shifted in tone. He began to describe hearing footsteps in the tower at night, when no one was there, and whispers that drifted down the stairwell from the lantern room. At one point, he admitted to locking himself in his quarters, convinced that something was moving through the lighthouse with him, though every search turned up nothing. The descent was gradual but unmistakable. His handwriting grew erratic, his words disjointed, as though his thoughts no longer flowed in a straight line. He described seeing figures on the rocks below, sailors with waterlogged faces staring up at him, unmoving even when the waves crashed over them. On other nights, he swore he saw someone standing in the lantern room, gazing out at the sea, even though he was the only one stationed at the post. These visions blurred the line between duty and delusion, until the man who once kept the light burning with steady precision began to falter. The breaking point came during one of the fiercest storms the coast had seen in years. Villagers reported that the light went dark in the middle of the night, and with it, the hope of sailors struggling against the waves. When relief crews arrived days later, they found the lantern extinguished and the interior of the lighthouse smeared with blood. The keeper was discovered in the lantern room, his body slumped against the wall, a knife still clutched in his hand. Some accounts claim he had taken his own life in the throes of madness, while others suggest he had fought against something, or someone, that left no other trace behind. The details vary, but the truth that remains is chilling: a man driven to the edge, consumed by forces that may have been in his mind, or may have been something far more sinister. What disturbed investigators most were the writings left behind. In his final entries, he spoke of voices urging him to turn off the light, voices that told him the sea must reclaim what had been denied. He wrote of a presence that stood beside him as he worked, a shadow that moved in ways the human body could not. The final words in his journal were scrawled with such desperation that they were nearly illegible. "It is here with me." No explanation was ever found for the blood that stained the walls, though theories ranged from self-inflicted wounds to hallucinations that drove him into violent frenzy. In the years that followed, those who took over the post reported strange occurrences that seemed to echo his torment. The sound of dragging footsteps in the lantern room, the faint metallic smell of blood in the air, and the overwhelming sensation of being watched were among the most common. One keeper resigned after only a few weeks, insisting that he had seen the madman's reflection in the lantern glass, even though he was alone. Another claimed that during storms, the light would flicker, as though unseen hands were trying to extinguish it, a chilling reminder of the night the beacon had gone dark for good. The tale of the keeper who went mad has become both a cautionary story and a ghost legend, illustrating the thin line between sanity and despair in places where isolation rules. To step into that lantern room, even now, is to feel the weight of what happened there, a place where duty gave way to delirium, and where the silence of the sea was broken, not by the beam of the light, but by a man's final screams. There is something unsettling about the idea of messages that cannot be explained, voices or signs that appear without any clear source, and in the world of lighthouses these mysteries seem to emerge again and again. For keepers surrounded by endless sea and silence, the sudden intrusion of a voice that should not exist was both terrifying and inescapable. Reports of strange communications carried through the wind, the waves, and even the very stones of the towers themselves are numerous, and each account adds another layer of unease to the already grim legacy of lighthouse life. These whispers from the sea, as they came to be called, were more than just tricks of the mind. They often carried messages, warnings, pleas, or commands that no one could ever fully explain. One of the most chilling aspects of these accounts is how personal the voices often seemed. Keepers described hearing their own names called out in the dead of night, the sound clear and unmistakable, even though no one else was on the island. Sometimes the voices belonged to loved ones, calling with urgency as though in distress, though when the keeper rushed to the door or lantern room, nothing was there but the crashing waves. In other cases, the voices were unfamiliar, low and mournful, like the cries of drowning men carried on the wind. These experiences were recorded so frequently in journals and letters that they cannot easily be dismissed as coincidence. The sea itself seemed to find ways to speak, and what it said was never comforting. One particularly disturbing incident involved a pair of keepers who both claimed to hear the same thing on consecutive nights. As they stood watch during a storm, they swore they heard a man's voice calling from beyond the rocks, shouting for help. Believing a shipwreck might have occurred, they braved the weather to search, but they found no one. The next night, the same voice returned, this time repeating a single word, down. Neither could explain it, and when the weather cleared, no wreckage or bodies were discovered. The men were shaken, and after reporting the incident, one refused to return to his post, convinced the voice was not human but something older, something that used the storm as a conduit to reach them. Technology did little to quiet the phenomenon. When radios were introduced in the 20th century, lighthouse keepers began to experience a new form of unexplained communication. Static-filled transmissions sometimes carried fragments of words or phrases that did not match any known frequency. Keepers reported hearing what sounded like distress calls in languages they could not identify, or strange rhythmic patterns of sound that seemed too structured to be accidental interference. In one case, a keeper listening to the radio during a foggy night heard what he described as dozens of overlapping voices, all whispering at once, rising and falling like the tide. He quickly shut the device off, but the whispers reportedly continued in the room for several minutes afterward, as if the voices had seeped out of the static and into the air itself. These whispered messages were not always warnings or cries for help. Some seemed deliberately malevolent. Stories circulated of voices urging keepers to extinguish the light, insisting that the sea demanded its due, and that ships must be allowed to crash upon the rocks. Others told of voices that mocked the keepers, repeating their own words back to them in distorted tones, as though something unseen was listening and choosing to respond. One man, after weeks of hearing his own voice echoed in the stairwell, finally resigned, leaving behind a note that read simply, "It knows me too well." Such accounts blur the line between external haunting and internal collapse, but the consistency across different lighthouses suggests there is more to these whispers than madness alone. Visitors who have spent even short amounts of time in abandoned lighthouses often describe similar experiences. Ghost hunters have recorded electronic voice phenomena, in which faint words can be heard beneath the static, sometimes repeating questions, sometimes issuing warnings. Tourists walking through damp corridors tell of hearing faint songs or chants rising from the sea below, melodies that stop abruptly the moment they are acknowledged. Even skeptics admit that the acoustics of the sea and stone can produce strange effects. But for those who have felt the chill of hearing their name, whispered by a voice that should not exist, scientific explanations do little to erase the terror. The whispers from the sea endure in legend, because they strike at a deep fear within the human mind, the fear of being watched, of being spoken to by something unseen and unknowable. For lighthouse keepers, already cut off from society and immersed in the relentless sound of the ocean, these mysterious messages were both a torment and a reminder that they were never truly alone. Whether born from ghosts of the drowned, echoes of human grief embedded in the waves, or forces that defy explanation, the voices have become part of the identity of these lonely towers, woven into the fabric of every storm and every stretch of silence between them. Among the most unsettling aspects of Lighthouse lore are the stories carried not by keepers or sailors, but by the locals who lived in nearby villages and coastal towns. These men and women, who relied on the sea for their livelihood, often viewed lighthouses with a mixture of respect and dread. While the beams saved countless ships from destruction, there were places where the towers themselves were believed to be cursed, where no one dared to venture after dark, and where the locals swore the lights guided more spirits than sailors. These cursed shores became infamous, and even today the stories cling to them like salt in the air. Fishermen were often the first to speak of these fears. For them, the sea was both a provider and a predator, and they believed that certain lighthouses stood on land stained by tragedy. Tales spread of areas where catches were scarce, boats capsized without warning, and storms seemed to rise suddenly whenever the beacon was lit. In their minds, the lighthouse was not a protector but a marker of misfortune, its light not saving ships but drawing them closer to their doom. Generations passed down warnings never to linger near such towers, claiming that the dead claimed dominion over the waters there. Some even insisted that if you listened closely on calm nights, you could hear the voices of drowned sailors calling from beneath the waves. Residents of coastal villages often told of figures seen wandering the shores near these cursed lighthouses. Women in soaked dresses walking barefoot across the sand, children laughing faintly before vanishing into the mist, men with hollow eyes staring toward the horizon, all of them glimpsed for mere seconds before dissolving into air or sea spray. For many villagers, these apparitions were not mere stories, but genuine encounters that they carried with them for life. Families who had lost relatives at sea often claimed the spirits returned to the lighthouse, bound forever to the place where their fate had been sealed. These sightings created a culture of avoidance, with locals steering clear of the towers and teaching their children never to approach them alone. Even in daylight, some lighthouses earned reputations as places where misfortune lingered. Crops and fields nearby failed more often, animals behaved strangely, and accidents seemed to happen with unusual frequency. Stories told of farmers who ventured too close and suffered mysterious illnesses, or of hunters who claimed their dogs refused to go near certain paths leading toward the coast. The fear seeped into every aspect of local life, turning ordinary landmarks into places of superstition. While outsiders dismissed these fears as exaggerations or folklore, the locals who lived in the shadow of the towers refused to dismiss the patterns of suffering they had witnessed firsthand. The cursed reputation of some lighthouses grew stronger with every tragedy tied to them. When ships were wrecked on the surrounding rocks, villagers whispered that it was no accident, that the lighthouse had failed deliberately, or even that its light had lured the vessels to their end. When keepers disappeared or died under strange circumstances, it was taken as proof that the land itself rejected human presence. The more the tragedies piled up, the more convinced the locals became that these places were haunted not just by restless spirits, but by a darkness embedded in the very earth. Some even suggested the towers had been built on ancient burial grounds or sites of forgotten rituals, making them magnets for misfortune. Reluctance to approach these cursed lighthouses extended into more practical matters. Supplies were often delivered late, as boatmen feared docking too close. Repairs went undone because workers refused to climb the towers, even for higher pay. Keepers who were stationed there faced not only the burden of isolation, but also the knowledge that the nearest communities had already marked their post as doomed. This created a sense of abandonment, as though those tasked with tending the light were already written off by the world outside. Such isolation only deepened the feeling of dread that seemed to hang over these lighthouses, feeding into the cycle of fear and tragedy. Even today, the legends persist. Tourists who visit these coastal towns are often warned with a knowing smile not to walk near certain cliffs at night, not because of physical danger, but because of the things that cannot be explained. Paranormal investigators flock to these sites, drawn by the reputation of cursed shores, and many leave with chilling stories of their own: equipment malfunctioning, unexplained sounds on recordings, or sudden overwhelming feelings of dread. While science may argue that salt air, shifting tides, and acoustics explain much of what is experienced, those who have lived for generations along these coasts remain unconvinced. They know the difference between the natural and the unnatural, and to them, the cursed shores where the lighthouses stand are reminders that some places are not meant for human habitation, that some lights do not guide but instead beckon the lost, and the damned modern accounts of haunted lighthouses are among the most unsettling because they come not from folklore or faded journals, but from people living today, visitors and workers who step into these abandoned towers expecting history and instead encounter something they cannot explain. These stories often begin innocently, with tourists eager to climb the spiraling stairs or paranormal investigators carrying their equipment into the lantern rooms. Yet again and again, they leave with tales that echo the experiences of keepers long gone. Flickering lights, footsteps that follow without source, and overwhelming dread when the beacon falters. It is in these moments when the light fails, whether by chance or by something unseen, that encounters take on their most terrifying form. Visitors frequently describe sudden shifts in atmosphere as they ascend a lighthouse. The air, heavy with salt and dampness, seems to change from room to room. In the lower chambers there is little more than the musty smell of age, but the higher one climbs, the colder it becomes. Some report a sensation of being unwelcome, as though unseen eyes are watching each step. By the time they reach the lantern room, the feeling is so oppressive that many refuse to linger, convinced they are intruding on a presence that does not want them there. Guides often laugh nervously about these sensations, but they cannot deny how many people independently describe the same experience. Electrical disturbances are another common phenomenon. In lighthouses that have been converted into museums, modern lighting often flickers or dies at strange moments, particularly during tours or events held after sunset. Cameras malfunction, batteries drain instantly, and audio devices pick up distortions even when tested beforehand. Paranormal researchers view these malfunctions as evidence of energy being manipulated, while skeptics point to faulty wiring. But when visitors capture unexplained figures in photographs, or record voices in otherwise silent rooms, even the skeptics admit that coincidence does not account for everything. One chilling pattern that emerges in these modern encounters is the recurrence of footsteps. Countless tourists climbing staircases have stopped suddenly, convinced someone was walking just behind them. The sound of boots on stone echoes with perfect clarity, yet when they turn, the staircase is empty. On rare occasions, people insist they actually saw a shadowy figure ascending or descending, only to watch it vanish around a curve with impossible speed. Some visitors have been so shaken they refused to continue the climb, while others raced downward and left the lighthouse altogether. Guides remark that the sound of phantom footsteps is so common it has become part of the expected experience. There are also reports of encounters tied directly to the lantern room. In several lighthouses, visitors have described seeing a figure inside the glass chamber at night, even when the tower was locked and inaccessible. Witnesses often describe the apparition as a man in keeper's clothing, silently tending the light as though his duties never ended. Others say they saw a woman dressed in white, standing with her face to the sea, her hair drifting as though caught in a wind that no one else could feel. These visions sometimes last for minutes, long enough for multiple people to confirm them, before disappearing as though they were never there. Perhaps the most disturbing modern accounts come from those who stay overnight in lighthouses that offer accommodations. Guests describe waking in the middle of the night to hear the sea pounding louder than usual, only to realize the sound is coming from inside the room. Others report dreams so vivid they wake in tears or screams, visions of drowning, shipwrecks, or arguments ending in violence. A few wake to find wet footprints leading across the floor, though no one in the party had left their beds. These incidents are rare but consistent enough across different locations to have created a reputation that lighthouses are not merely haunted in memory, but actively inhabited by something restless. Paranormal groups that investigate these sites often bring advanced recording equipment, and many leave with chilling results. Voices are captured in electronic voice phenomena, whispering names or phrases that appear to address the investigators directly. Unexplained knocks and bangs are recorded in patterns resembling responses to questions. Shadows appear in video footage moving against the flow of light. Each new recording adds weight to the growing belief that lighthouses, with their tragic histories and endless exposure to death at sea, hold on to something that refuses to fade. The persistence of these modern encounters suggests that the haunted reputation of lighthouses is not merely folklore preserved by nostalgic sailors. Something continues to stir in these towers even now, long after their lights have been automated and their keepers gone. For those who dare to step inside during a storm or in the stillness of night, the experience is more than historical. It is immediate, personal, and unforgettable. The moment the light fails, whether by chance or by unseen will, the line between past and present seems to dissolve, and those who walk the tower become witnesses to the same terrors that plagued the keepers centuries before. The legacy of lighthouse horror is not bound only to the past or to scattered modern accounts, but to the way these stories have become woven into the very identity of the sea. For centuries, lighthouses have stood as symbols of safety, their beams slicing through storms and darkness to guide sailors home. Yet with every tale of tragedy, disappearance, and haunting, they have also come to represent something else: loneliness, despair, and the persistence of forces beyond human control. Each tower, whether still operational or left to crumble against the elements, carries with it the weight of countless lives that touched its stones, both saved and lost. When people speak of haunted lighthouses, they are not just telling ghost stories, they are remembering the sacrifices and terrors of those who lived in isolation, who faced the merciless sea day after day, and who sometimes lost themselves in the process. The final accounts from keepers, locals, and visitors reveal that no matter how much time passes, the atmosphere of these places resists change. Automated lights still flicker strangely, storms still gather with sudden violence, and those who step too close still speak of hearing voices or feeling watched. There is something timeless about the fear tied to lighthouses, as though the ocean itself preserves memories in the crashing waves and refuses to release them. Unlike haunted houses, which eventually decay into silence, lighthouses remain active participants in their surroundings. They continue to shine their beams outward, their presence inescapable to sailors who rely on them, and their history impossible to bury beneath rational explanations. In the modern world, where technology has removed much of the human element from navigation, the idea of lighthouse hauntings is even more chilling. If no keeper lives inside, then who climbs the stairs at night? If no one tends the lantern, then whose shadow moves against the glass? These questions unsettle even the most skeptical, because they suggest that the presence within these towers is not just memory but something enduring. The dead, it seems, have not abandoned their posts, and in many cases they may never leave. Whether bound by duty, by tragedy, or by forces we cannot begin to understand, the spirits tied to lighthouses continue to make themselves known, long after the last human keeper turned the key and walked away. For coastal communities, these stories serve as reminders of the cost of life by the sea. The ocean has always demanded sacrifices, swallowing ships and sailors with little warning, and the lighthouse has always stood at the center of this struggle. It is both guardian and tombstone, both savior and curse. Locals honor it with respect but never without fear, understanding that the same light that brings safety may also illuminate the faces of the lost. For them, the tales of hauntings are not just superstitions, but a way of acknowledging the power of the sea and the fragility of human existence beside it. As these stories spread into books, films, and whispered conversations, they ensure that the legacy of haunted lighthouses will never fade. Each retelling breathes life into the old tragedies. Each new account adds another layer to the mystery. For those who love the eerie and unexplained, the lighthouse has become an enduring symbol, a beacon not only for ships but for horror itself. It represents the place where human isolation, natural fury, and the supernatural intersect. And as long as the ocean continues to rage and the towers continue to stand, the stories will go on, haunting us the way the sea haunts every shore. And so our journey comes to a close, but the echoes of these tales linger. The keepers who vanished, the voices that whispered, the cursed shores, the figures seen in lantern rooms. They remind us that some mysteries were never meant to be solved. Lighthouses may have been built to guide sailors to safety, but they also guide us into the darkest corners of human imagination, where fear and fascination become inseparable. The next time you see a light cutting through the storm, ask yourself, is it really just a machine, or is someone, something, still inside, waiting, watching, and keeping the flame alive? Thank you for joining me on this chilling voyage into the world of true lighthouse horror. Your time, your curiosity, and your courage to face these unsettling tales mean more than you know. If you felt the shiver of the sea in these stories, share them with others, because legends live on when they are spoken aloud. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never ignore the whispers carried by the waves